This is a download from the BBC. To find out more and for our terms of use, please go to bbc.co.uk. Hello. To decide is to divide, said Tony Blair when talking of Margaret Thatcher. Well, this week the controller of Radio 4 took a decision which certainly divided the feedback audience.
What you don't seem to understand is that we're not interested. Sorry to shout, but you asked for it. I could not believe that Radio 4 cancelled this morning's programmes to give coverage of Thatcher's funeral.
Listener Grace Benson, more from her supporters and opponents later. The controller of BBC Local Radio took another divisive decision when, to save money, he cancelled local evening programmes and made every station carry the same new show. A few months on from the change, what do his listeners think?
There's no local news, there's no local travel, no local interest, and a presenter with no local knowledge.
Controller David Holdsworth will be responding to listeners' views shortly. And from division to harmony. Feedback finds out what it's like to take part in a nerve-wracking Radio 4 music quiz presented by one of the smoothest voices on radio.
The only moments of the show which are painful are not when somebody loses by 1 or 2 points. It's when they lose by 20 or 30 points. And I've got to somehow try to pump it up.
But we begin with a story which has competed for headlines in the last couple of weeks with the death and funeral of Baroness Thatcher, the measles outbreak in South Wales. Time was that whenever the MMR jab was mentioned, so too was its alleged connection to autism. The tone of the coverage is now very different. Today, any BBC report seems to feel duty-bound to dismiss any possible link with autism out of hand, and to blame the current outbreak largely on those who had previously suggested there was a connection, notably Dr. Andrew Wakefield.
Take-up of the MMR vaccine in this area dropped significantly in the late 1990s when Dr. Andrew Wakefield published research claiming a link between the vaccine and autism. It has since been totally discredited.
BBC reporter Sian Lloyd, all of which prompted listener Don Benson to get in touch.
I was shocked to hear Sian Lloyd, reporting on a surge in measles cases in South Wales, say that in the late 1990s, Dr. Andrew Wakefield claimed there was a link between the MMR vaccine and autism, and that this claim has since been totally discredited. Surely this is incorrect. I believe he only claimed a possible link. Moreover, it is only true to say that this possibility of a link has been widely rejected within the British medical hierarchy, not totally discredited.
So, has the BBC gone too far the other way in dismissing any possible link? And how do BBC journalists decide what constitutes balance in dealing with similar health scares? Questions for the BBC's medical correspondent, Fergus Walsh. I began by asking him why he felt the use of the statement totally discredited was justified.
It's unusual to be that categoric. I think on this occasion it's fair to be that categoric. If you look at the evidence, Andrew Wakefield's original, very small research paper from 1998 has been categorically debunked to such an extent that The Lancet, which originally published it, has withdrawn it completely. No other scientist has ever been able to repeat what he claims to have done. And regarding the man himself, let me just quote you what I wrote when he was struck off 3 years ago. In a damning judgment, the GMC, the General Medical Council, said he'd shown a callous disregard for children he treated, was dishonest in his research methods, abused his position as a doctor, and was irresponsible. Now, I could go on. That's just the tip of it.
Well, Don Benson says, wouldn't it have been better to say that the possibility of the link between the MMR vaccine and autism has been, quote, widely rejected within the British medical hierarchy, not, in other words, totally discredited, widely rejected. Why not use that phrase?
Because it wouldn't be fair to the audience. We have a duty when we report not just to do a he says, she says as some kind of vague attempt at balance. We have to present if there is overwhelming, absolutely overwhelming scientific opinion, not just from this country, from around the world, nearly 100 countries around the world that use MMR, and all the research papers that have poured out since his very small research paper dealing with 12 children came out in 1998.
Why do you think that is such an emotional thing and has allegedly had such an impact on the numbers of children being vaccinated, or should I say not being vaccinated?
it's an emotive issue because here was a doctor who had some research which he felt made it justified to say that single vaccines would be a good idea without anything to back that up. And then you had parents whose children had developed autism, which is often spotted in the second year of life, who were looking for a reason why that had happened. And they went to the media, they supported what he said. So it was very easy for the media, and the media did not always behave responsibly over MMR, to highlight and inflate the claims of Dr. Wakefield quite wrongly.
But setting this particular case aside, there is a worry here, I think, from some of our listeners, that if you're not careful, whatever the medical establishment says, the BBC will say, well, that must be true, when we know in the past that establishment has been wrong. And most new developments and breakthroughs happen because people question the orthodoxy. So people are a bit worried when you use such a categorical phrase as totally discredited about a view which is an alternative to the medical orthodoxy.
I completely support the idea that mavericks, that people with contrary views, they deserve to have a voice. And Andrew Wakefield had quite a lot of airtime over the years, but there's been so much research on MMR that has shown that it is a safe vaccine. I mean, all medicines, including vaccines, have some side effects, but the side effects that he was suggesting do not appear to be in any of the literature that have come out from all the countries in the world.
But how do you get the balance right here between what is an orthodox opinion and what is perhaps a radical, unorthodox one? I mean, Professor Steve Jones was asked by the BBC Trust to report on this question of balance and how you report, and he said that it's very dangerous if you give equal time to both sides of an argument when, let's say, one side of the argument is held or supported by 1% and the other is by 99%. In the past, he's criticised you for giving, as it were, equal weight to both views. How do you decide that now?
Well, I do not think we should be censoring minority views in the respect that there is a place for people who take a contrary opinion to the majority to have a voice, but we owe it to the audience not to do a report where we have one person saying one thing and one person saying another and claim that is balance. That's a false balance. So you're quite right that when there are new medical breakthroughs and people who challenge orthodoxies or whistleblowers, we have a duty to be open to new research which challenges the established opinion. But what we have to do is to follow the science. And if people produce evidence that shows something new or something that turns science, accepted scientific thinking or medical thinking on its head, then we should report that.
The BBC's medical correspondent, Fergus Walsh. Now, time to test your musical knowledge. In opera, what is a brindisi? Or perhaps you'd prefer, which Beatles album contains Dear Prudence and While My Guitar Gently Weeps? These are the kind of questions you might face if you were a contestant on Radio 4's music quiz Counterpoint, which has been a mainstay on the network since 1986. It was first presented by Ned Sherrin, and its current chair, Paul Gambaccini, took over the reins in 2008. By the way, the answers to those questions are, a brindisi is a drinking song, and those Beatles songs are on the White Album. But you knew that, didn't you? To find out more about the nail-biting life of a quiz contestant, we met barrister Rufus Stilgo, taking part in the first of a new series of Counterpoint, recorded this week for broadcast early next month. Rufus has tried his hand at a Radio 4 quiz just once before. It was Brain of Britain earlier this year. He was unsuccessful. Could this be his night? We spoke to Rufus as he made his last preparations at his home in South London, just a few hours before the Counterpoint recording.
I have to say I'm not very good at learning lists, and what I tend to do is to look for connections in things, and this is Beethoven's Leonora Overture No. 3, but this one, which I've been playing on YouTube, has got Leonard Bernstein conducting it, and that makes a connection for me which makes me think of Leonard Bernstein's own works as well. And so that's the way I've been kind of working. It's not structured, but it works for me. And Counterpoint, it is completely different from doing Brain of Britain, where you do just literally have to learn list after list after list of things that you may not be very much interested in. This is a quiz about something I love.
What I will be doing very soon is rehearsing you.
We're in the Radio Theatre in BBC Broadcasting House about 3/4 of an hour before the recordings start. Paul Bajorio, the producer, is just about finishing his briefing, and after he's done so, I'm going to see if I can get a few words with him and with the presenter, Paul Gambaccini.
No, I mean, the other thing which might emerge from the rehearsal is...
Can I ask you, Paul Bajorio, before contestants get here, what will they have to have done?
There's a fairly complex application form. Then you have a fairly intensive audition, whereby the same 30-odd questions are asked of each contestant. And that helps us to not only get a spread of musical knowledge, but that they're also balanced in terms of the quality of their voices, their geographical origins, their genders, and their backgrounds. So,
I mean, you're doing an entertainment programme, so you don't just want the most knowledgeable people, do you?
You've said it exactly. It's an entertainment. And, for the listener, the last thing they want to hear is 3 guys or 4 guys who sound exactly the same, because it then becomes very difficult to tell them apart.
Now, Paul Gambaccini, the person we're following this evening, Rufus, is a relative newcomer to the whole process. Will you be helping him during the course of the quiz at all?
You don't want to affect the result. That would be unfair. But if someone is clearly going to lose, you want to make it interesting, and you don't want to have them suffer. So if we know they're not going to win, I may try to give them an oblique hint, because the only moments of the show which are painful are not when somebody loses by 1 or 2 points. It's when they lose by 20 or 30 points. And I've got to somehow try to pump it up.
And if we were to ask Paul Gambaccini to be a contestant, and if we had a specialist round, what would be the round that you would avoid at all costs?
I would avoid anything about death metal.
Thank you very much. We've popped outside into a totally airless corridor to have a word with Rufus Stilgoe. Rufus, there's one obvious question I have to ask you. Why on earth do it?
I suppose it's the challenge of doing it properly rather than just being at home and shouting at the radio, which is what we all do, I presume. But the tension is very exciting. It gives it a real buzz.
Well, I hope you do enjoy it.
Thanks very much. Thank you.
The last members of the audience are finding their seats here in the Radio Theatre in Broadcasting House. Only a couple of minutes to go, I think, before we start recording. But as well as relative newcomers like Rufus, very serious so-called professional quizzes also form a proportion of contestants as well. One of those who recently caught the interest of some feedback listeners was from TV's Eggheads, Barry Simmons.
We are now going upstairs to my 2 bedrooms. And there's bookcases in both of these bedrooms. I think I've probably got about 7,000 books. And it's never enough. Reading quiz questions is boring for learning, and it doesn't stick. But if you read a lot of facts about something in a book, there's all hooks where you can remember things and you can relate them to everything else. And that makes it easier to understand and to learn.
Up there towards the end, but not quite enough for David Stainer. So the 60th Brain of Britain champion is Barry Simmons. The warmest of congratulations to him.
In the Brain of Britain final, because I was an egghead and I'm on television, I felt there was a great deal of pressure on me to perform well. And of course, because I knew some of the other competitors intimately, I was well aware of just how capable and how strong quizzers they really were. So all the controversy about my being an experienced media performer, out the window at all. The reverse, if anything, was the truth. I've never done Counterpoint. It's one of my favourite quizzes, but I never felt I had enough in-depth knowledge. However, perhaps in years to come I will have a shot at Counterpoint.
Well, we're now back in the Radio Theatre. The 3 competitors are on the right-hand side of the stage, quite closely together with their names up front. Here we go.
Counterpoint.
Rufus Stilgoe, here is your first question. Which composer's 2 string quartets are named, respectively, the Kreutzer Sonata and Intimate Letters? Shall we order a pizza? It's close enough so that anyone could win. It's on the buzzer in the quick-fire final round. Fingers poised, here we go. What would a brass instrument player understand by the instruction con sordino? And Rufus says?
Put the mute in.
That's right. On which island did Chopin... Join us if you can. Until then, from all of us here at the Radio Theatre in London, goodbye.
Well, we've just finished recording. I'm not allowed to give the result, but I can say it's one of the tightest finishes you could possibly imagine. How do you feel, Rufus, after that?
Oh, that was incredibly exciting.
You had a bit of trouble at the beginning, didn't you? It was one of the longest pauses I've ever heard in any programme. You couldn't say anything. Were you stunned by that?
No, I think I was trying to work it through in my mind, trying to get somewhere.
But you didn't get anywhere.
But I didn't get anywhere with it, no.
When you first go onto the stage, does the presence of the audience make it more difficult to answer?
To start with, you're very aware that they're there, but that wears off quite quickly, and your focus is on Paul Gambaccini and the questions. And occasionally there's a moment when the audience break in with a reaction, and suddenly you're back in the room, as it were.
Well, without giving the game away, you did very well indeed. So thanks very much indeed for let's follow you through what for me in the audience was a nerve-wracking experience. Thanks. And you can find out Rufus's fate when Counterpoint begins in May. Our thanks to him, to contestant Barry Simmons, producer Paul Bajoria, and quizmaster Paul Gambaccini. And in the meantime, here's another quiz question for you. When is local radio not local radio? Answer when it's the Mark Forrest All England show.
It does seem for some that life begins when you start to get a little older. For others, once you hit a certain age, that's it, it's all over.
Is he talking about me? Back in January, as part of an £8 million package of cuts to local radio, a wide variety of regional shows covering the 7 to 10 p.m. slot was replaced by one, broadcasting to all 39 local radio stations across England and the Channel Islands. At the time, we heard from a number of less-than-pleased listeners bemoaning their losses. And those, mostly negative comments, have kept coming.
Lee Horwich. I don't have anything personally against Mr. Forrest and have given it a fair go, but the programme is not local, and as such, it's a pitiful replacement for the local station evening programmes up and down the country.
Hello, I'm Peter Wilson from Bridlington. I've started listening to the Mark Forrest programme because I just enjoy the mix of items in the programme that it draws from across the country, and where a common theme, and this often seems to happen on the programme, brings things together across the country, I find that very enjoyable.
Gwen Taylor. My husband and I used to listen regularly to Roger Day on Radio Sussex before the change. We tried the new format, but it's not for us. During the week, we switch off.
At the beginning of the year, we put together a panel of local radio listeners to discuss the changes. And now that the new programme has had time to bed in, as radio executives like to put it, we've got two of those listeners back to go head-to-head with the BBC's Controller of English Regions, David Holdsworth. They're Nick Garner from Chelmsford, and first Sue Cashmore from Bournemouth. As you cannot fail to notice, she's still not a fan of Mark Forrest's show.
Well, there is no comparison to what we've lost in local radio. And it's the wrong format for that time of night. There's no local news, there's no local travel, no local interest, and a presenter with no local knowledge.
Well, can I come across to David Holdsworth? What was your ambition for the programme? It can't be local in the sense that other local radio programmes are local, so what were you trying to do?
Well, I'm obviously disappointed to hear Sue say that, because we'd like to please all the listeners all the time if we can. The position is that in different financial circumstances we wouldn't have set out to make this kind of programme, but the budgets are where the budgets are, and we needed to find a way of saving money somewhere in our schedules. And what I think we have come up with is something that is, I think, quite an exciting blend of companionship, music, discussion, and the best topics of the day that local radio has featured, brought alive through conversation and discussion involving listeners. And some of the feedback we've had has been very positive.
But do you have any ratings which can tell us whether or not the programme is at least holding its own in that slot compared to what went before?
Well, we will have those ratings. They're measured on a quarterly basis. So by this summer, we'll have a sense of where the audience figures are going. So we obviously look at those. We look at the critical feedback we receive, and we review the programme. But I would want to repeat the point that I think it's quite exciting. I have heard discussions on items as varied as one of our reporters dug out the possible loss of the apostrophe as ordered by Devon County Council, and that opened up a very interesting discussion about the way English has evolved from different perspectives. The night of the Stafford Hospital inquiry report, I heard some really strong editorial material from different listeners about how they rated their hospitals and the different perspectives from different parts of the country. So we've got that, but alongside that, we do still have that friendship, that companionship, and that music, which I know our listeners treasure. And I will also add, both to Sue, it's available elsewhere in the schedules.
Can I come across now to Nick Garner, who's in BBC Essex in Chelmsford? Nick, what's your concern about this new show? We know that you regretted very much the killing off of the local radio programmes that went in its place, but what's your criticism of this programme?
Well, what has replaced it is something that, in my view, you can listen to on Radio 5 Live, you could listen to on Radio 4. We have another national magazine programme in my area with Sue Marchant. It's not just music that Sue used to cover, it's the whole of the arts as part of things, from local book programmes to theatre. Now you have a short little snippet and they're talking about things that aren't relevant to us.
Well, could I ask David Holdsworth here, is there anything you can, solace that you can offer Nick here about local music, local arts and so on? Can they still get onto both, BBC Essex and across your network?
Yes, I'd like to do that because one of the things in many ways that I'm most pleased about the new programme is that on a nightly basis it's featuring the best of the music that we have on our BBC introducing programmes. Each of the local stations has a specialist programme that showcases new music, up-and-coming bands, and those tracks, the best of those tracks, are now being featured in effect to a national audience. So I think that's an excellent example of where this programme can bring something new to BBC Radio and actually develop the brief.
The local radio in the evening is a local voice for local people, and to a lot of people it is a lifeline who are on their own, as I am, at home and you used to welcome to listen to that friendly voice. I want to know about my local area, what is happening with local people in my local area, as I feel many others, everyone I talk to, agrees with.
David Holdsworth, are you going to review the programme? I mean, it is an experiment, as you said at the beginning. At a certain point, perhaps in the summer, when you get the audience figures in, are you going to seriously review the programme and perhaps commission something else?
We continually review all of our programmes and we will look at the figures as they come in for this. We certainly set out to make it for the first year with these new budgets. So at the end of that year, we will take stock, take account of the views like the ones we've heard this morning, look at the audience figures, get a sense of how we feel it's doing in terms of quality, and then plan forward. But I would have to repeat the point that if we were to change this, we would have to change something else because the budgets aren't going to change.
Can I come in about the budgets, please, David? Just a quick tally up of some of the figures that I've got. James Harding, newly in post, 340,000 plus benefits. Leasing back TVC at £3 million a year. Helen Bowden, 340,000 plus benefits. The payoff to George Entwistle for 54 days' work is 450,000.
Well, I know that a lot of people who write to us who think executives are overpaid, but just tell me overall, David, what is the total budget for BBC Local Radio?
It's more than £100 million. We spend a substantial amount of the licence fee on local radio, and so we should. It's a really important part of the contract that I think a public service broadcaster offers to local communities. But it is also right that when the BBC is trying to set new budgets, that we play our part in terms of delivering those savings.
Are you telling BBC management that local radio can't take any more cuts? I mean, you've gone into the bone on this occasion, and that in future there should be no more cuts.
Everyone, including the BBC Trust, is clear that the budget, as now set, can't change during the course of this licence fee. And I'd want to add on top of that, when it comes to the next licence fee and the next charter, I would want to be very bold and ambitious about the way we take local radio forward at that point, addressing the points we've heard this morning, and I hope expanding the remit of the chain.
By which, of course, he means the many-linked chain of local radio stations. Our thanks to David Holdsworth, the BBC's Controller of English Regions, and to listeners Sue Cashmore and Nick Garner. Now, it's no surprise that the country is divided over the achievements and legacy of Baroness Thatcher, and the coverage of her death and her funeral on Wednesday certainly divided listeners' opinion. Both 5 Live and Radio 4 carried extensive coverage, with Radio 4 clearing the morning's programmes to spend 2 hours covering the funeral live.
The procession is just arriving now outside the cathedral. We can see the gun carriage with the coffin draped in the Union flag.
Nicola Smith was impressed.
I thought the coverage of the funeral of Lady Thatcher was excellent, especially Anita Anand and Robin Lustig, who appeared to be really well informed. But all the team did extremely well, and even James Nopty managed not to interrupt anyone.
But others were far from pleased.
Hello, this is Lucy Stockton calling from Whitstable. I was dismayed this morning to realise that 2 hours of airtime was to be devoted to the funeral today. Oh, so many people, licence fee payers, are deeply uncomfortable, actually, with the way that this whole matter's been handled. I think that the public appetite for this has been thoroughly misjudged.
My name's Jill Ellard and I live in Preston in Lancashire. And I've just heard on the radio Jane Garvey announce that Woman's Hour will not be broadcast on Wednesday because of the Thatcher funeral. And I'd like to know whose decision this was, because there must be millions of listeners who are not in the least bit interested in the funeral. And I think it's disgraceful that the BBC have removed all choice from regular Woman's Hour listeners.
Well, Jill, I will be sure to put that question to the person ultimately in charge of Radio 4 when she comes into the studio next week. Controller Gwyneth Williams will be here to talk to listeners about her, or should that be your, network. And this is your opportunity to talk directly to her about the Thatcher programming, or indeed anything else you'd like to raise. Since the Controller's last appearance on Feedback, Radio 4 has marked several public occasions, from the Jubilee to the Royal Wedding and the Olympics. The Controller has also presided over a number of Radio 4 seasons and special events, such as the Listening Project.
Well, when I saw you first, I was over the moon because you were long and skinny. And I said, is it OK if I call him Francis? And he said, that's a lovely name.
Some programmes on her network have disappeared, and some have changed. For example, Saturday Live has gained an extra half hour and a new presenter.
Welcome to Saturday Live, where to be young is very heaven. So let us take you back to your salad days.
And earlier this year, she announced her intention to throw fireworks into the station's schedule, countering Radio 4's political and economic coverage with a fresh focus on a taste of culture and arts, colourful, unpredictable and original work. You've probably heard Trails for the Cultural Exchange, in which leading public figures will talk about their cultural influences, and which kicks off with Tracy Emin discussing a Vermeer painting on Monday. A lot to talk about then, and I know you will find this difficult to believe. I'm looking forward to taking a back seat, because when the interview is recorded next week, we'll arrange for as many listeners as possible to phone into the studio and speak directly to the Controller. So do get in touch right now to let us know what you'd like to ask the boss. The agenda is not hers or mine, it's yours. So please write to Feedback, PO Box 67234, London SE1P 4AX, or leave a phone message on 03 333 444 544. Standard landline charges apply, but it could cost more on some mobile networks. Or you can email feedback@bbc.co.uk or tweet us at bbcr4feedback. All those details are on our website. The alternative, of course, is that I ask all the questions. Now, surely you want to avoid that. Goodbye.
South Wales say that in the late 1990s, Dr. Andrew Wakefield claimed there was a link between the MMR vaccine and autism, and that this claim has since been totally discredited. Surely this is incorrect. I believe he only claimed a possible link. Moreover, it is only true to say that this possibility of a link has been widely rejected within the British medical hierarchy, not totally discredited.
So, has the BBC gone too far the other way in dismissing any possible link? And how do BBC journalists decide what constitutes balance in dealing with similar health scares? This is a download from the BBC. To find out more and for our terms of use, please go to bbc.co.uk. Hello. To decide is to divide, said Tony Blair when talking of Margaret Thatcher. Well, this week, the Controller of Radio 4 took a decision which certainly divided the Feedback audience.
What you don't seem to understand is that we're not interested. Sorry to shout, but you asked for it. I could not believe that Radio 4 cancelled this morning's programmes to give coverage of Thatcher's funeral.
Any possible link with autism out of hand, and to blame the current outbreak largely on those who had previously suggested there was a connection, notably Dr. Andrew Wakefield.
Take-up of the MMR vaccine in this area dropped significantly in the late 1990s when Dr. Andrew Wakefield published research claiming a link between the vaccine and autism. It has since been totally discredited.
BBC reporter Sian Lloyd, all of which prompted listener Don Benson to get in touch.
I was shocked to hear Sian Lloyd reporting on a surge in measles cases in South.
Listener Grace Benson, more from her supporters and opponents later. The controller of BBC Local Radio took another divisive decision when, to save money, he cancelled local evening programmes and made every station carry the same new show. A few months on from the change, what do his listeners think?
There's no local news, there's no local travel, no local interest, and a presenter with no local knowledge.
Controller David Holdsworth will be responding to listeners' views shortly. And from division to harmony. Feedback finds out what it's like to take part in a nerve-wracking Radio 4 music quiz presented by one of the smoothest voices on radio.
The only moments of the show which are painful are not when somebody loses by 1 or 2 points. It's when they lose by 20 or 30 points. And I've got to somehow try to pump it up.
But we begin with a story which has competed for headlines in the last couple of weeks with the death and funeral of Baroness Thatcher, the measles outbreak in South Wales. Time was that whenever the MMR jab was mentioned, so too was its alleged connection to autism. The tone of the coverage is now very different. Today, any BBC report seems to feel duty-bound to dismiss